Hello and welcome to a video lecture that I've put together on my comments about your first essay, rough draft. In this lecture, I wanted to talk about common strengths and weaknesses of your personal narrative essay rough drafts. According to our text, these are the characteristics of personal narrative essays. So we have, first of all, a clearly identified event. So event or series of events. So I think everyone pretty well succeeded in that. A clearly described setting, when and where did it happen. I think everyone succeeded in that. And then I tend to look at these first three bulleted items as kind of tied together, vivid descriptive details. So the entire story needs to be, clearly identified, clearly described, make use of vivid descriptive details. In this part of the essay, I am pushing you as much as possible to be concrete and specific and vivid and descriptive, use of sensory details, use of dialogue. I think that one of the things I've seen occasionally in some essays is people talking about people talking and not just having them talk. So one of the things our text talks about that I've tried to emphasize as well is show and not just tell. So instead of telling that someone said something, why don't you have them actually speak? And that helps to put the reader more immediately into the situation. And so any of these things that we can do to make it more vivid for the reader, we want them to kind of see things through our eyes, take a walk in our shoes, so that when we get to the conclusion and we're reflecting on the significance, that they're more able to go along with us because they've kind of experienced this with us. So, consistent point of view, who's telling the story. We didn't talk about it, but by all means, you need to use I in this essay. You should always use I if you are talking about yourself. Sometimes people use I when maybe their focus should be on their topic instead of themselves. But in a personal narrative essay, you're talking about yourself, so you have to use I. So, and then finally, a clear point. Why does the story matter? This is the conclusion of your essay, the reflection on the significance, and this is, in effect, the argument in the essay. So we need to provide a good, thoughtful, reflective conclusion to the essay. Okay, so let me talk about a few more things here. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to talk about is strategies for kind of getting into and out of this particular essay. So I know that a lot of times we think of an essay as starting with a broad, overarching introduction, starts broadly, kind of narrows and focuses, comes down to a thesis statement. But when we're writing personal narrative essays, we typically don't write those kind of standard introductions. So in fact, sometimes I refer to those as kind of throat clearing or warm-up devices to get you writing, but sometimes it's better to start a little further down in your essay. So, and it's not that you're scrapping that and that it's wasted. It was useful in getting you to a better starting point. So it's all good. So some strategies that I was thinking about. One is borrowed from filmmaking called in medias res, in the middle of things. So instead of starting, for instance, with such a broad introduction, start in the middle of the action. Maybe start with someone talking. Start with, this kind of sounds like a cartoon, but a door slammed and a shot rang out, this type of thing puts the reader immediately into the action as it's happening. So consider doing that. I think starting in the middle of things is a great way to capture your reader's interest. Another one also borrowed from filmmaking or from theater is mise en scène, filling the scene or setting things on the stage. Sometimes the first paragraph can be devoted to vivid descriptive details about a particular setting. So, and then we move on to some action after that. So, okay, a framing device is something that you've mentioned maybe in the introduction to the essay, and then you also come back to it again in the conclusion of the essay. So frequently, the framing device is some type of narrative. Maybe you start off your essay with a story, and then you kind of return to the story at the end, while maybe going off and talking about something else in the middle of the essay. So it could also be maybe a particular phrase or something. Maybe it's part of your title or something, and you kind of come back to it at the end. So it's framing in that, we kind of have something at the beginning and something at the end, and they act as a frame to hold the essay together. So kind of related to that is something that I call a touchstone device, which is maybe a phrase that you return to several times throughout the essay. So maybe it's your title, you mention it again maybe in the intro, then it comes up later in the middle of your essay, and then again in the conclusion. So you kind of keep coming back. These types of things, a framing device or a touchstone device, kind of impress the reader by showing a writer who knows what they're doing. You didn't just start writing until you got to the end, but you actually were thinking stylistically about, I want to start with this, and then I also want to end with this. And it has a feeling of coming full circle, and that actually creates kind of an emotional response in your reader. They feel, right in the middle of their chest, a very satisfying feeling that, we've come back to something. So framing devices and touchstone devices are nice things to use. Another thing to use is a quote or an epigraph. Epigraph, epi means before, graph means writing. So it's a bit of writing that comes before we get into the essay. And typically it's between the title and the first paragraph. So I wanted to show you an example of that. So hang on for a second. Okay, so this isn't the greatest example here, but I put up a title placeholder, and then I have my epigraph, something from one of my favorite quotes from Ralph Waldo Emerson: "Nothing great was ever accomplished without enthusiasm." And then I space down 2 or 3 spaces, and then I start my first paragraph of my essay. So that's an epigraph, comes at the beginning of the essay. People sometimes use a quote at the end of an essay. But remember, when you do so, you are also giving up the opportunity to have the last word in your own writing. So think about that carefully. Okay, so let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, another strategy that people sometimes use is a question. I noticed at least one of you used a question right at the beginning of your essay, and that kind of pulls the reader in. Sometimes the question is moved down closer to the end of the first paragraph, kind of where we might find a thesis statement. And the implication is that you'll answer this question somehow throughout your essay. I don't see questions used that often at the end of essays, but I think you could. So I would test it on someone else before you commit to it. Another strategy that I've seen used in intros and conclusions is actually taking your concluding paragraph and moving it to the introduction. I don't know how well this will work in the personal narrative essay, but sometimes we write our way toward what we're trying to say, and sometimes in the introduction we're just kind of making a stab at it, and we actually say it better in the conclusion. So again, I'm not sure how successful this will be with a personal narrative essay, but it's something to think about trying out maybe in some other essays that you write. Remember that you oftentimes write your way toward what you're trying to say. Okay, and then I mentioned this earlier, throat clearing and warming up, that sometimes we generate a lot of text in order to get going, and so look, after the first paragraph or this 2 or 3 paragraphs down into your essay, and see if maybe this might make a better starting point. It might actually involve in medias res or something like that. So again, that writing that you wrote as kind of throat clearing and warming up, while you're deleting it and getting rid of it, it hasn't been wasted. It enabled you to get to the point where you are in your essay. Okay, so did have a couple of thoughts on the importance of your conclusion. One that we've already mentioned, it's your argument in your paper. The personal narrative essay is a highly persuasive essay form, but it's just not written in the same straightforward argumentative essay structure that we're used to, where we have the thesis at the end of the introductory paragraph, and then main points backed up by supporting evidence, main point, supporting evidence, main point, supporting evidence. Instead, by telling the story, we're offering all of our supporting evidence up front, and then when we go to the conclusion and we become highly abstract, then we are trying to make sense out of things, make meaning out of things, and this is a highly abstract process. And I'm trying to push it in this direction because in Bloom's taxonomy of intellectual development, interpretation and analysis are right at the top. And so I'm trying to push you in that direction of interpretation and analysis. And most studies show that college-aged people are right at that kind of cusp in their intellectual development of looking at things more interpretively and analytically. And so I'm pushing you in that direction. Okay. It's the takeaway for your reader from your paper. It's the act of transference. Is something that now that they've kind of taken a walk in your shoes, seen things through your eyes, that they can say, okay, this makes sense, and I can apply it to my life. So should not be overly obvious. I forgot to mention that. So things that you've heard said before, like don't cry over spilled milk or life goes on or something, are usually too pat. I'd like to hear you kind of articulate it in your own words. This is highly abstract thinking. We talked about that. And so with abstract thinking, words become elusive. So language never equals the experience. There's never this one-to-one relationship. And now that we're dealing with abstract thought, you have to be, I think, talk your way around it more. And so I oftentimes use these little sentence stems. In other words, to put it yet another way, what I'm really trying to say, and I'll see how many different ways I can kind of flesh out my ideas, and then I'll try to, keep the best ideas. Occasionally, I do keep those, in other words, to put it yet another way, what I'm really trying to say, I'll keep those stems on the beginning of the sentence, because they kind of show a writer thinking on paper, and that's very appealing to your reader. So, for a writer thinking on paper, we tend to use modals, which are like might and could, or qualifiers like perhaps, to kind of soften our argument a little bit. We're thinking through this. We're trying to come up with some conclusions, so we're not quite sure. We're just testing this out. So those can be very effective toward your readers. Okay, we talked about a writer thinking on paper. And another thing is with your conclusion, it might take 2 to 3 separate writing sessions. I usually make a stab at the conclusion my first time through, and then I'll go off, and it allows me to kind of turn it over to my subconscious and think about these things. And then I come back and sit down, and then I've got some fresh ideas, and I try to further develop that. And I'll go back and forth several different times. So you don't need to feel like you can magically get it in one shot. 2 to 3 separate writing sessions is not uncommon. Okay, and so those are my thoughts on your rough drafts, and so thank you for your time.